On December 7th, 1941, the chief military installation in Kansas was here at Fort Riley, home of the 2nd Cavalry Division. Riley was and is a nostalgic place, one that conjures up the romance of the American frontier. But the military destiny of Kansas in World War II lay not with Fort Riley and its 2nd Cavalry, but here, in Wichita, where the Boeing Corporation created, except for the atomic bomb, the ultimate technological weapon, the B-29 bomber. And here, at Smoky Hill Army Air Force Base outside Salina, where the crews for those bombers were trained. The shift from Horse Cavalry to B-29 was symbolic of the great changes that World War II would bring to Kansas and to Kansans. Kansans awoke on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, to sunshine and unseasonably mild weather. Topeka had a high of 56 that day. Since 1939, the world had been convulsed by war, and Kansans knew they might be pulled into the vortex. But they went about their Sunday preparations without any particular foreboding. Those on farms and ranches had chores before they could look forward to church, rest, and diversion. Milking, feeding stock, and the other routine farm jobs were done that morning largely as they'd been done for generations, tediously and by hand.
We didn't have many luxuries. We didn't have many, the food that we had was not as great as we would like. The variety wasn't as great as we saw today. We generally raised our own meat out there on the farm. And of course, refrigeration was very limited. So the way we preserved food at that time was primarily by canning, some drying. A few of the farms did have some electricity, but that came on later in about 1945, 46, about the end of the war.
In Kansas towns and cities, life was easier and more convenient than on the farms. Wichita and Topeka were cities by Kansas standards, but with their limited populations and small-town atmospheres, the rest of the nation probably regarded them as little more than overgrown trading centers. Kansans, urban and rural, shared many old-fashioned experiences and values. The United States was already an actual but unrecognized belligerent in the war. From its outset, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Congress had given first moral support and then concrete assistance to the nations fighting Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. In early 1941, FDR pledged that America would become the arsenal of democracy, and that by 1942 up to 60% of the nation's industrial capacity would be devoted to war production. Congress gave the President broad authority to lend and lease, in reality give, materials, supplies, and equipment to any country whose defense was considered vital to the United States. Before December 7th, American armies were nowhere in combat, but the Navy was already in an undeclared war with German submarines in the North Atlantic, as U.S. warships provided security for foreign convoys bound for the battlefields of Europe. The dangerous state of the world left the United States no realistic choice except to prepare its own defenses. Though the first steps in American military security were reluctant, few, and short, Congress voted a larger military budget in 1941 than in the previous 20 years combined, and 1.5 million men were in Army uniforms by the middle of the year. This Army was unprepared to fight, and the country was unwilling to let it. Woefully short of equipment, broomsticks served as rifles, and trucks substituted for tanks in maneuvers. Only a few experienced soldiers were available to train unenthusiastic draftees. Public opinion polls indicated Americans desperately wanted peace. Though they doubted war could be avoided, it would have to be forced upon them. And war was not foremost in their thoughts on that December 7th. As dedicated churchgoers, many Kansans had returned from services and picked up the newspaper or turned on the radio while they waited for Sunday dinner. 7,000 miles away at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands, early risers were contemplating breakfast. American military forces were at high-level alert, but with few visible signs of urgency. The deceptive calm erupted at 7:55 a.m. when the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared in to strafe and bomb Army installations, airfields, and ships at anchor. It was 12:20 p.m. at Fort Riley, Topeka, Wichita, and Eudora. What were you doing at the time of Pearl Harbor? The Pearl Harbor generation can instantly and vividly recall what they were doing and how they learned of the attack.
My sister and I were preparing dinner for several of the young men that worked with my brother-in-law at the aircraft factory. She had invited them to eat with us that day because they had no families here. And I remember we were almost ready to sit down to the table to eat, and we heard this announcement that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And everybody just sit and looked at each other rather stunned. We didn't know what to think. It was hard to take something like that, even though we knew that our government was preparing for something. It still was almost unbelievable.
I was the only one home. I was thinking about going out and milking those 20 cows. And the news came on that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. And I immediately, of course, was very concerned because it meant that we were in World War II, or would soon be. And at that particular time, I thought, who cares about those little slant-eyed Japs over there? Because we'll go over and we'll bump them off. And it took about 4 years to do it. But they weren't near the pushover. They had done a lot of planning. They had done a lot of building. And then the next day, we had our assembly in school. And President Roosevelt came on, and the national anthem was played. We all stood up, and at that time, he was asking that war be declared. And again, I thought, this isn't going to last long. And I found out that I went a lot of miles at Uncle Sam's expense before that thing finally ended.
Neighbors, relatives, and friends passed on the news, and within a few hours, probably every Kansan knew the country was at war. Immediate reactions among Kansans varied. Overall, they were shocked but not surprised, angry but not hateful, upset but not uncontrolled.
I think everyone, once we got in the war, were willing to let partisanship go by the wayside and work together and attempt to win the war and get it over with and get on about our business.
At no time did I ever think that the United States would not win the war. At no time. Such an idea never entered my head, nor did I know anyone who felt that the United States might be defeated.
The mood of Kansans suggested a calm, even disinterested acceptance of history. A reporter described business as usual in downtown Topeka on December 8th, and when the president signed the declaration of war at 3:12 p.m., the Topeka Daily Capital reported,
"Nothing happened. Traffic and pedestrians filled the streets, and shops and business houses were enjoying the greatest pre-Christmas boom in years. But while Kansans went unemotionally about their business, a stream of young men poured in and out, hour after hour, at Army and Navy recruiting offices in Topeka and elsewhere."
Times had improved as America became the arsenal of democracy and began as well to build its own defenses. By 1941, 50 million Americans were employed, exceeding by 5 million the previous peak year of 1929. Many were Kansans with new jobs in the expanding defense industries and at military installations. With wheat at 98 cents and corn at 64 cents a bushel, prices received by Kansas farmers were the highest in a generation. Whereas citizens of warring nations usually sacrificed their standard of life, that of Americans rose in World War II. The repercussions of war on society are always complicated. Change is predictable, but not its form. War may impair or strengthen democracy, expand or contract tolerance, weaken or reinforce institutions, and eclipse or sustain values. It may result in all of these simultaneously. The balance of this program is concerned with the change, for better or worse, experienced on the Kansas Homefront in World War II. The war modified homefront life at every level, from the most significant to the routine. The strongest impulses of Kansans were to protect their homes, end the war, and return to normal life. Civilian defense became a primary outlet for Kansans to perform patriotic and social service and to contribute to the war effort. Within days of the outbreak of war, 200,000 Kansans had signed up. Authorities were concerned about nuisance raids, sabotage, and suicide teams that might launch gas attacks. Practice blackouts became community events. In some communities, unscheduled blackouts from electrical storms caused considerable excitement, even panic. But repulsing the enemy was never more than a minor civilian defense activity. More important, it both reflected and promoted the renewed unity resulting from a common threat. Organized under the civilian defense capstone were programs that spanned the society, enlisted every institution, and touched every person, even children.
I remember we even got involved in the war effort because everybody did. We had metal drives. I particularly remember there were tin can drives. If you bought a can of peas, you emptied the can of peas, then you cut the bottom off of it, you flatten it out, you put the two lids inside the can, and you put it in a box. This was for the war effort. We collected other things, rubber drives, I remember, all sorts of drives. Then at school, where we were expected to help with the war effort there too, we could buy from our teacher war stamps. I'm sure most people have heard of war bonds, which were nothing more than government savings bonds, but kids couldn't afford the $18.75 it cost to buy a war bond, but we could bring a nickel or a dime or a quarter and buy a stamp. And week by week, we would accumulate first $1, then $5, then $10, and eventually we would have enough accumulated in stamps so that we could buy a war bond.
Backyard gardens, so necessary to family life during the Depression, became victory gardens.
So we were producing our own food. I remember one thing that still impresses me today, and I think it's just as important today as it was then, and that was the victory garden. Everybody had a victory garden. That meant that anybody that could grow a tomato plant or grow some type of food was out there growing a garden to supply food that for their own needs so that other food could be sent to the armed services and to feed those allies and the people that we were supporting overseas.
The relationship of all the programs to the war was clear, and many others as well. American Legion posts organized blood drives to save the lives of wounded servicemen. Schools made sewing rooms available to make items for the armed forces. Public libraries sponsored victory book campaigns with local women collecting books for soldiers, sailors, and Marines. Local civilians manned the USO canteens for servicemen set up at military posts, in major cities, and at railroad and bus stations.
And here in Emporia, we did our duty by knitting sweaters, doing various things for the Red Cross. Of course, the Army Mother's Canteen at the depot was really a wonderful thing, and lots of people baked cookies and gathered up magazines and took all kinds of things down there to be given to the troops on troop trains that went through.
The war effort was defined in broad terms that demanded change in society for the purpose of waging war with greater spirit and skill. This was evident in the programs to strengthen the family, increase educational opportunity for youth and adults, and improve public health and nutrition. A society of highly educated, physically fit, and socially responsible citizens would be best able to win the war. This notion gave strength to programs that might have been resisted in peacetime. A variety of councils and groups established programs for adults, and families received special attention. The Wichita Family Life Program organized one of the first nutrition programs in the country. One neighborhood council founded a daycare center for the children of working mothers. The Wichita PTA sponsored programs that emphasized the importance of family life. Self-help centers in the city instituted recreation programs for the young, and stressed cooperation to raise community spirits. World War II is not usually perceived as a time of expanded social consciousness and responsibility, but that was the situation in Kansas. While Kansans were becoming more socially conscious, they were also becoming more patriotic. Governmental and private groups lost no opportunity to arouse patriotism. Appeals to work harder and longer, save scrap metal, and live cheerfully with rationing of gas, tires, and sugar were wrapped in patriotic symbols and rhetoric. Nearly every standard of conduct and expression was judged on whether it was conducive to or detracted from the war effort. Patriotism enveloped Kansas, and if there were reservations about the war, they were not evident. Nevertheless, the extreme wartime patriotism could have led to intolerance and grave abuses against groups and individuals whose loyalty, often for baseless reasons, was suspect. This had frequently happened in Kansas in World War I, but was nearly unknown in World War II. There were even signs that tolerance was on the increase. Before the war, black Kansans enjoyed many constitutional rights, but they were definitely second-class citizens. This was apparent in widespread discrimination and the wall of social separation between white and black. But when in 1941 Governor Payne Ratner supported full participation of black citizens in defense programs, a small first breach was made in the racial system. Blacks joined civilian defense programs, segregated of course, and expressed pride in the organization of a Negro unit of the Kansas State Guard. But this was more a hope for the future than a reflection of dramatic change. With all this interest in the war effort, Kansas did their best to carry on, to do as they had always done. Many ordinary things acquired greater significance because they symbolized the purpose of the war and had greater poignancy because of the absence of loved ones. Adjustments, of course, had to be made, especially for wartime shortages and rationing.
One thing I do remember, one hardship we went through was that we could no longer get candy. Before the war, we liked Hershey's and we liked Snickers bars and all that. When the war came along, the sugar had to go into the war effort, and we got substitute candy. I think the worst one I remember was called a ribbon bar. It was a little red, white, and blue coconut kind of thing that we thought tasted like shoe leather.
One couple passed out homemade white lightning at their chivalry because candy was unavailable. Their wedding cake was made of sugar saved over a long period, and a short honeymoon trip was possible because they received a ration stamp for 5 gallons of gas as a wedding gift. Carpools, bans on outdoor Christmas lights, and cancellation of church dinners were ways that Kansans tried to demonstrate their patriotism. Kansans, like other Americans, were asked to sacrifice without complaint. But cases of actual deprivation were rare, if they happened at all. Some of the most important changes on the home front took place in Kansas agriculture. The war accelerated change in rural Kansas and imprinted a new character on the countryside. Farm population declined from 607,000 in 1940 to 495,000 in 1945. Technological and economic influences responsible for this declining rural population were not new, but the exigencies of war made them more powerful.
And I'd been down at Fredonia running a farm while my husband was in Montana. I never had been on a farm in my life before. But I was down there until the help just kept, I couldn't keep help. They discovered that Boeing paid more than I could. So they kept going to Boeing and Beech, and I finally wrote my husband and told him I was going to sell off the portable stuff, and I was going along with the help. So that's what I did.
But while farm population was declining, farm production was increasing dramatically.
We began to gear up for high production, not only in industry but out on the farm. And out on that farm we were somewhat limited because we were not familiar with the modern varieties, the modern techniques that we have today. Many of us were farming with horses. Many of the people were just beginning to find the use of tractors. but horse-drawn equipment was still very prevalent at that time. And so we plowed up everything from fence row to fence row.
Nearly all the severe problems that afflicted farmers during the Depression and Dust Bowl abruptly disappeared with the advent of war. Crop surpluses that had dragged down prices were a memory. High prices backed by government guarantees, apparently infinite markets for crops, and the spur of patriotism induced farmers to stretch production to the limit. The Kansas State Board of Agriculture cited production records as evidence of the tremendous contribution of Kansas toward the inevitable victorious conclusion of World War II. Affluence was a new experience for Kansas farmers, who had their highest cash incomes in history during the war. The $595 million they received in 1942, for example, was more than double the average for the years between 1936 and 1940. Increased farm income can best be comprehended in personal terms. In the depths of the Depression, farmers had struggled to stay in business, had lived on credit, and gone without basic necessities. Some farmers made enough in World War II so that for the first time they paid income taxes and had the security of savings. They could escape perennial mortgages, add acreage to farms, and even afford vice. One farmer recalled that he knew things were better when he could buy distillery-made liquor rather than home brew. While many farmers still used old-fashioned harvesting methods, farming became increasingly mechanized. One outstanding example was the rise of the custom combining industry. Combines were in short supply, and the government would not allow production in the volume needed. Some custom combining outfits had traveled the regions before the war, but now a class of professional custom cutters was created that followed the ripening wheat north from Texas to Canada. Still, technology could not offset the shortage of labor. The acute shortage of agricultural workers led to one of the most unusual episodes of the war, the use of German prisoners of war as laborers on Kansas farms and ranches. POWs performed a variety of jobs, including harvesting potatoes, dressing turkeys, milking cows, and shocking Kaffir corn. Many Kansas farmers said that their crops were saved by the POWs. Kansas liked the polite, good-humored, and industrious POWs who were grateful for the generosity and kindness of their unchosen employers. The experience changed the perceptions and attitudes of both groups. Kansans learned to judge the POWs on their individual qualities without regard to the abhorrent Nazi philosophy of the nation they served. POWs received a practical lesson in democracy and often acquired a genuine fondness for the American way of doing things. Former POWs and Kansans still exchange recollections and news by mail, and some have been able to visit each other. The return of former POWs to reaffirm friendships have even been the occasion of community celebrations. Imbued with the American dream, some POWs return to become citizens, raise families, and enjoy the freedom, opportunity, and the vast open spaces that had impressed them as prisoners. The change that World War II brought to the farms of Kansas hastened an agricultural revolution that continues today. And change came not just to the farms of Kansas, but to the towns and cities as well. Of the small cities and towns, one strongly affected by the war was Eudora, which found itself a neighbor of the rapidly expanding Sunflower Ordnance Works. Housing was constructed near the plant and is still in use today, but Eudora was the closest town, and the Sunflower workers flocked there in search of recreation. In early 1943, a YMCA was set up in the old Opera House. The Lawrence Journal-World later reported,
"The building had no water, and water for coffee makers had to be carried in. No mention is made of restroom facilities, and so one would suppose they were out back. The Y sponsored lectures, classes, and parties, and held checkers and ping-pong tournaments. Graveyard shift workers were served meals when they came off at 7:30 a.m., and second shift workers, who left the plant at 11:30 p.m., could dance until 2:30 in the morning. At times, as many as 300 people crowded the tiny hall. On occasion, concerts were given by a USO orchestra under the baton of Professor Russell Wiley of the University of Kansas Band."
In June 1943, an expanded facility was opened, but the workers were already moving out, and the director, Miss Alice Moore, was transferred to other duties. Before she left, the high school student body and the faculty gave her a compact and the city of Eudora presented her with a sapphire pin. Wichita was a major center of a wartime industry. Rapid expansion of aircraft manufacture was responsible for an unparalleled economic boom. Compelled by government policy and lured by jobs and high wages, new workers from country and small-town Kansas and surrounding states engulfed the city.
What attracted me to Wichita was the opportunity for better employment than was available in the small town, Carrollton, Missouri, where I was raised. And my brother-in-law was sent to Wichita to work at Boeing by an aircraft school in Kansas City. And they wrote to me and told me that they thought I would have much better chance to find work here in Wichita, and for better wages also.
An important but minor industry soon assumed major proportions. Only 3% of Wichita's population relied on the aircraft industry for their livelihood in 1939, but by 1943 the proportion had jumped to 1/2. The size and spread of the wartime population shift subjected Wichita to enormous strain and tension.
You know, there were all kinds of people at Boeing, and I have listened to people who said, "Oh, those Boeing people, they were a rough lot." Some of them were, some of them weren't. It was just a cross section of America. And they were just Americans as far as I could see.
But Wichita adapted.
Movie theaters began to stay open extended hours, even went to 24-hour basis. Restaurants stayed open all night. You consider here that at that time, virtually everything was downtown. Like most cities, everything was downtown. No malls, all this type of thing, and the emphasis of all this activity, of course, was down in the business district. People had newfound money, I think, some rather beyond their fondest expectations and rather relatively soon. Just as an example, I think it was the ambition of most women in that era to have a fur coat. Well, a lot of these girls got employment out here, and the first thing you know, they're walking up and down Douglas Avenue with a fur coat. They'd achieved their lifelong ambition.
Cessna, Beech, and Boeing all shared in Wichita's expansion, but Boeing was the biggest story. Its Wichita operations in 1940 were basically confined to the manufacture of cadet trainers. In 1939, the Army Air Corps notified airframe companies that it had a super bomber in mind and asked them to prepare estimates. The Boeing design won the competition, and the company built experimental models, while it constructed a second Wichita plant 10 times the size of the first to mass produce the bomber. Boeing engineers literally redefined principles in their field to create the B-29 Superfortress, which was called the most perfect blending of harmonious parts ever achieved in the science of aerodynamics. Built under tight security, Boeing delivered the first of over 1,600 Superfortresses in July 1943. The B-29 could fly faster, higher, and further with a heavier payload than any other World War II bomber. At peak production, over 4 B-29s a day came off the Boeing assembly line. The Boeing workforce jumped from 700 in 1940 to 29,000 in 1944. By 1943, 31,000 women were employed in the Wichita aircraft industry, many in jobs thought suited only to men. These women were mythologized in songs, movies, and posters as Rosie the Riveter, laboring at a drill press in bib overalls and a bandana to protect America.
Oh, you would be surprised at the percentage of women who were building those planes. Riveters, you'd see women out there who had never done anything but housework in their life, and they were put in there. They got some training, you know. and so forth, and they were working right along with the men on the planes, and an awful lot of the women were doing the riveting and that sort of thing. There was a lot of work that women could do and liked to do, but and they worked together surprisingly well. I always thought they did an awfully good job of converting to something that was totally strange to them, you know.
Cora Phelps liked working at Boeing, but when asked about the treatment of women, she replied,
"Well, it was just about what it is now down underneath. The men folks still, they were used to being the heads of the family. If there was a good job, they got it. And if there were a lot of them who resented the women, but they knew they needed this and they had to have us. But there was a good bit of resentment of it, but sometimes you'd be surprised at the individuals who backed the women up on. Some of them had the idea that the women ought to be able to earn money and eat and buy clothes and things just like a human being.
Women were often changed by the experience in both small and large ways. Some acquired a preference for slacks even outside the factory, and others decided they would continue to work outside the home. It was all part and parcel of a movement that helped to change the role of women in American society. Nowhere was the movement of Kansans from rural to urban areas more obvious and telling than in Wichita, whose population more than doubled within 3 years. Housing was especially critical.
Old sheds, garages were converted for housing. Basements had 1 or 2 or 3 apartments added, and people just came in from everywhere and put up with, in some cases, phenomenal conditions, because we had that patriotic spirit that there's a job to do and let's do it as soon as we can. And many of these people only wanted to be here as long as the duration, and they put up with very poor housing in lots of cases, and worked long hours and just stuck it out.
A partial answer to the housing problem was to build the new town of Plainview on the Kansas Prairie close to Wichita. Plainview, a war housing project for Boeing workers, was completed in 15 months and became the 7th largest city in Kansas. With 4,400 dwellings and 20,000 residents, Plainview had 117 miles of sidewalks, a 1-million-gallon water reservoir, schools, parks, and playgrounds, and something new.
It's quite interesting that remote shopping centers, at least one in particular, the one at Plainview, was the result of the war itself. And here it took a war maybe to develop this, but this is what happened in Plainview itself. We had a separate shopping center that included a theater. It actually had a grocery store, a 5 and dime, of course, several filling stations, and community hall, whatever. It was the first identity of anything of this manner that we ever had in Wichita.
The Miracle community was a good example of wartime adaptation. Plainview institutional practices were to reflect the particular and urgent needs of workers and their families. When convention interfered, it was disregarded. Schools, for example, completely revised schedules and activities and expanded operations to include daycare nurseries for the children of working mothers. The Plainview experience was duplicated throughout Kansas and the country. War changed the needs of society, and institutions responded. Wartime strain on institutions and persons was intense everywhere, but it was especially pronounced in Kansas. Less than 42% of Kansans lived in urban areas in 1940, but that increased to over 52% because of World War II. Only 12% urban in 1940, Johnson County was over 70% by 1950. Social adjustments to the huge population influx entailed urgent problems greater than those of mere physical accommodation. This influx wrenched the community life known by longtime residents. Often just off farms, the newcomers had few, if any, acquaintances and were unaccustomed to organized community life and group activity. Wichita used the schools as social centers to introduce the newcomers to neighbors, engage them in group events, or simply provide them with an opportunity to relax or pursue a hobby. Public institutions of Wichita, as in many cities, adopted policies that would likely never have been considered in peacetime. The public library began a bookmobile service for the convenience of factory workers. Many programs common in communities today for recreation, education, and entertainment had their origins during World War II. Private enterprise also had its influence. Wichita even developed a nightlife, and one that threatened a Kansas tradition.
But dance halls were just going full blast, and I can certainly relate to one that was quite popular, and it's called the Blue Moon. In fact, it's out very near where the Boeing plant is today. And the Blue Moon, of course, would have your very fine bands, first class sometimes. Maybe even Glenn Gray occasionally would frequent there, Charlie Spivak, some of these. But it's very common to, at that time, to carry in maybe a bottle of booze and place it under the table. No one would, think differently, because everyone did it. And as long as it wasn't visible, that was sort of the understanding at that particular time. So you might say Prohibition sort of took a back seat at that particular time in our history.
Every social institution experienced acute stress, but none more than the family. Long separations between married couples were common and contributed to the highest divorce rate in the country's history. Disquieting statistics recorded an increase in juvenile delinquency, school dropouts, and emotional disorders among the young. Problems abounded even among unseparated families. Both parents often worked long and irregular hours, and neglected children had many opportunities for wayward diversions. Schools tried to compensate with additional activities, summer programs, and greater supervision. The stress of war had severe consequences for children, even in their play.
Then we really began to take on the role of soldiers when we played. You could buy helmets, you could buy Thompson submachine guns, if you had the money. You could buy a .45 automatic, and we even went to the so far as to choose up sides as you would in other games and have mock battles. And we really had very accurate copies of weapons. I remember, as I said, the Thompson submachine gun. I remember 30 caliber machine guns on tripods and so on. These were all available to us, and actually we were, I think, encouraged to play with them because there was a great patriotic spirit, and this was fostered in the children, I think.
Eventually, the war became real, even to the children. Ray Call remembers his uncle, home on leave.
But then he began to tell us a little bit about the war, and I think the most frightening story I remember was, he said they were in foxholes and trenches at one point, and they were throwing hand grenades back and forth. In other words, they would pull a pin and throw a grenade over, and if it hadn't exploded, he would pick it up and throw it back, and the poor unlucky soul who happened to be there when it exploded was either killed or maimed for life. That began to sink in, and I began then to understand the horror of war. And I also remember when Claudia came home on leave that time, he was trembling. He bordered on what we call then shell shock. He was just a nervous basket case. It was so terrible. He got over it, of course, but it was a vivid experience for me. And from that point on, I think I began to to understand what they meant when they said war is hell.
The Kansas Homefront was affected by the military itself. Even before Pearl Harbor, Kansas had learned to live with the military draft and with battle casualties. In the fall of 1941, Rice County resident Leonard Keever, an 18-year Navy veteran, went down with 100 other Americans when the destroyer Reuben James was torpedoed by a German submarine. At Pearl, the first Kansan reported killed was Corporal Gordon Mitchell of Hoisington. Governor Ratner gave Corporal Mitchell's memorial address as a tribute to all Kansans who had died in the attack. All told, 215,000 Kansans served in the armed forces in World War II. Among them, the most famous soldier of them all, General Dwight David Eisenhower of Abilene. Of these 215,000, more than 3,500 gave their lives in the naval and island battles of the Pacific, in North Africa and Italy, in air battles over Europe, in the invasions in France and Germany, and too often in such things as training accidents in the skies over West Virginia. Not all who died were servicemen. Merchant Marine radio operator Peter Carrier went down with the Liberty ship Melvin E. Stone in the Caribbean. The message he got off just before the ship sank led to the rescue of most of the crew. Old-time barnstormer Raleigh Inman of Inman Brothers Flying Circus perished in a crash in Maine while piloting a C-54 transport from England to Washington. New York Times correspondent C.L. Sulzberger spoke the epitaph for all Kansas men and women who died in World War II when he wrote his essay, The Life and Death of an American Bomber.
The short, sweet life of Hadley's harem began in December 1942 when a 4-engine Liberator bumped off a California assembly line, and simultaneously a crew of 10 youngsters met for the first time at an Arizona airfield. The brief cycle ended almost exactly 8 months later when, battered and perforated, its nose shot off, and its engines feathering streams of flame, one small Gremlin insignia eviscerated by flak, Hadley's harem, bearing its cargo of dead and wounded, slumped heavily into the tranquil Aegean Sea. A swift career born and died. The 10-man crew of Hadley's harem came from 9 states and ranged in age from 19 to 23. The pilot was First Lieutenant Gilbert Hadley of Arkansas City. He had given his name and his life to the cumbersome aircraft.
World War II took Kansans to every corner of the world. It also brought every corner of America to Kansas in the form of tens of thousands of young men who learned the trade of war in military bases and colleges on the Kansas prairie.
During the war, there was an Air Corps cadet unit stationed at the university, and the community went all out to make those boys welcome and to make their stay pleasant as possible. They would organize plans to take them into their home for Sunday dinners and to make life as pleasant as possible for them. And later, after the war, some of those, a great many of those boys came back to Emporia, finished their schooling, and some of them married here in Emporia, went into business here, and are still here.
In the process of assimilation, traditional Kansas hospitality was strained, sometimes to the limit, sometimes sadly.
I lived in a little apartment during the war, and there were 3 other small apartments in the building, which were all rented to cadets' wives. And when their husbands would, with the group of cadets, march down the street to the Santa Fe station to be moved someplace else, we'd all go out and stand along the street and cry.
Occasionally, the strain had its humorous moments. On February 27, 1943, State Senator Willard Brown of Emmett complained that bombers from the Topeka Army Air Force Base had dropped 6 bombs on his ranch, destroying a chicken house and so frightening his 2 hired hands that they threatened to quit. The bombs were 4 miles off target, and Willard asked the Senate to pass a resolution protesting poor marksmanship. In the beginning, Fort Riley was the principal Kansas training center. Before the war, Riley had been an almost ideal Army post.
You talk to people who were here at that time, and it really was it was a nice place to be. You had a lot of good social activities on post as well as the surrounding area. You had the polo teams, plus there was a polo team from the local area, Junction City. Like Dr. O'Donnell, for instance, who had been a World War I doctor, who was on the local polo team, and they played polo against the teams from Wichita, Kansas City, and brought them up from Oklahoma. And of course, there was the weekly fox hunting event. So it really was, and I've talked to a couple of people who were boys, were raised here in the 30s as scouts, and the only Boy Scout troop that was mounted Boy Scouts was right here, and the kids went riding twice a week, every Wednesday and Saturday. And of course, they had the best instructors in the world at that time. They had the cavalry school instructors, and they used the cavalry school horses.
Riley and his cavalry were, in their way, throwbacks to frontier days, when the cavalry had led the onslaught against the Plains Indians. By 1941, there were those who thought cavalry had long outlived its usefulness. The Army was of another mind. As late as 1931, an officer by the name of George S. Patton argued that cavalry would always be necessary to defend a nation where 80% of the roads were still unpaved. This was still Army doctrine as the nation prepared for World War II. The Army began its cavalry expansion by reactivating Riley's Camp Funston from World War I.
But those billets that are there were built during the 1940 buildup, when it took them about every 45 minutes they had another building done. It was mass production. Just throw them together, and if you dropped your nail or hammer, don't worry about it. Keep on going, because they needed the buildings. And also at the same time, Camp Forsyth was built up, which was a cavalry replacement training center.
In 1940, the Army reorganized the cavalry unit stationed at Riley into the 2nd Cavalry Division. The 2nd consisted of 4 regiments, 2 white and 2 black. The influx into Riley of both white and black troops presented an interesting case study in Kansas racial relations, both at the military installation and in Junction City and other nearby towns. Black units had long been stationed at Riley, but now they arrived in force. Among them was Joe Louis, heavyweight boxing champion of the world. To provide recreation for the troops, black as well as white, USO centers were set up, not only at Riley, but near other Kansas military posts, and in the major cities, where they served not only military personnel, but also defense workers and student soldiers, sailors, and airmen at local colleges. All manner of local buildings were utilized, from municipal centers to the old Harvey House at Topeka, and most of the funds were raised by local donation. By early 1944, the 43 USO centers in Kansas were serving 375,000 uniformed men and women each month. A black USO was organized in Topeka a week after Pearl Harbor by Ezekiel Ridley, a black teacher and principal with the Topeka Public Schools. For more than a year, Ridley struggled along in a room 24 by 25 feet until he finally moved into a 5,000 square foot 2-story building. On October 1st, 1941, the Topeka Capitol reported that there were 2 temporary centers in Junction City. The white USO was in the Municipal Auditorium, while a residence was in temporary use for Negro soldiers. On November 15th, 1942, the Kansas City Star described a visit of Riley's 8th Squadron of black troops to Salina, and inadvertently some of the difficulties of providing them with appropriate companionship. The black soldiers had decided to hold a dance at Riley, and, as the source of the account, a Salina white public school teacher put it,
"Since Kansas had never had so many Negro lads in its midst, a question of finding the feminine contingent for the dance became the problem of the moment. Corporal Joe Louis had the answer. Bring in girls to Fort Riley from Kansas City, Topeka, Lawrence, Abilene, Junction City, and Salina. Corporal Louis even used some of his own money. The dance was a huge success, and the girls from Salina invited the squadron to the Booker T. Washington Center, the hub of all Negro activities in our city. Recruited for the occasion were 100 beautifully clad young women from McPherson, Junction City, Great Bend, Abilene, Lyons, and Ellsworth, but still the girls had to be rationed. The visit of the 8th began with a parade led by Lewis carrying the American flag. A chicken dinner was provided and a dance followed. The whole affair seemed a very commendable demonstration of the real democracy of our country.
By 1942, it was evident that cavalry would be of little use in the war, and the 2nd was disbanded. Most of the white personnel were transferred to the 9th Armored Division, which also was stationed at Fort Riley. The black cavalrymen were shipped off to serve as stevedores in the African campaign. But even after the breakup of the 2nd, the Cavalry Replacement Center continued to operate for both horse and mechanized personnel. The last horse officer candidate class graduated in 1944, though most of the later horse trainees ended up in pack mule units. The shipping of black cavalrymen as stevedores to North Africa and the difficulties of organizing black USOs reflected the prejudice of the day. Nevertheless, the service of black soldiers in World War II was a step toward the civil rights movement of a later day, a movement to which Kansas had contributed its share. By 1943, the most important military training in Kansas was no longer for ground troops, but to meet the burgeoning needs of both the Army Air Force and the Navy for flying personnel. Naval air stations were established at Olathe and Hutchinson in 1942, the latter mostly on land purchased or leased from Amish farmers. Construction of the Hutchinson base was a particular trial for the little town of Eudora. D.M. Beachley's general store was unable to meet the demands of construction workers, especially for cold pop. Beachley's monthly allowance was consumed by the thirsty workers in a single day. For years, Missouri Pacific agent E.J. Golden and his wife had managed the Eudora station by themselves. Now they were supervising an army of helpers.
I was the second officer to arrive at Hutch. We recruited the enlisted men, some 1,500 of them, in just 10 days from Kansas and Missouri. There weren't any quarters, so they had to be billeted at the 4-H buildings at the state fairgrounds. There weren't any mattresses. We asked Washington to ship some, but before we got the mattresses, we got a large shipment of books on how to play water polo. No commissary. We simply had to buy the food from the local grocery stores and cook it in borrowed pots and pans. The city fathers, of course, wanted some kind of a big ceremony, so after a little really basic training, we did stage an impromptu dedication. The 27 officers all had their uniforms, but the enlisted men had to parade in, as the account said, their cleanest civilian clothes.
In spite of all this chaos, Olathe and Hutchinson, which became the largest inland naval base in the nation, produced more than 8,000 naval flying personnel by the end of the war. But the big Kansas military story in World War II was the numerous Army Air Force bases which dotted the state. At Coffeyville, Independence, Arkansas City, Winfield, Topeka, Dodge City, Harrington, Great Bend, Liberal, Hayes, Garden City, and Pratt. It was from the Pratt base that the first B-29, bound for the Pacific, took off. The biggest of all was the Smoky Hill Air Force Base near Salina, in size the third largest Army installation in the nation. To speed up the deployment of the B-29 to the Pacific Theater, the Army Air Force conceived the idea of testing the aircraft and training crews at the same time. These two tasks were Smoky Hill's great contributions to the Allied victory. By 1944, the need for new military personnel was winding down, and all but a few of the air and land training bases began to close. Of the World War II bases, today only Riley and Fort Leavenworth remain. The military installations had served the nation well in wartime. They would do the same for Kansas in peacetime. Some were converted or reconverted to municipal airfields. Land was turned back to Amish farmers. Walker Air Force Base between Hayes and Russell became the subject of litigation, as farmers demanded the opportunity to buy back their land, which had been found to contain valuable oil deposits. Smoky Hill continued on for some years as Schilling Air Force Base, with missiles added, but eventually it closed. Today it houses Kansas Technical Institute. Perhaps the most typically Kansas conversion of the former airfields took place at Pratt and Harrington. Parts of the two bases, with their excellent underground drainage and 8 to 14-inch concrete runways, were converted to cattle feedlots. In August 1945, World War II came to an abrupt end with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. How did Kansans feel about the use of this terrible weapon? They had no doubts.
Of course, in those days we had really no fear about radiation. This wasn't in our mind, or about the thing wiping out the entire world. We weren't aware that that was a threat. What we saw was a dramatic weapon that would bring about the end of the war, and it was a great cause of jubilation. We supported Harry Truman. We thought he was a great man because he had the will to end our war.
And if I could make one opinion, it's probably as controversial as anything going. The best thing that ever happened was the dropping of the atomic bomb, because when we set up at Baguio on Luzon Island and we were getting prepared to invade Japan, I could just see how many more of us were going to die, like died at Subic Bay, at Bataan, at Manila, and those places. And I was rejoiced at the thought of President Truman having guts enough to drop that bomb, because it did get attention to it.
Aside from the immediate and all too brief euphoria of final victory, what had World War II really meant to Kansas and its people? More than anything else, it had meant change, and not just from Horse Cavalry to B-29. Kansans came out of the war with a different economy, a different society, and to some extent with different ideas and attitudes. Change has always been the natural state of America, but compressing a generation of change into 4 short years strained the institution and emotions of Kansans probably even more than those of their fellow Americans. Yet Kansans had met these challenges with unusual resilience, perhaps as a consequence of the adaptability learned on the frontier and in the more recent trials of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. When the war ended in 1945, Kansans looked forward with confident optimism to the future, though the outlines of that future were still unclear. Kansans, like other Americans, sensed that they had left a past and entered a new age. As one Kansas woman confided to a Life magazine reporter, "When I see a transport plane flying over my house and realize that it will be across the Atlantic in 14 hours, I know that the world is a lot smaller than it used to be, and that Kansas is no longer far from anywhere." Still, Kansans believe strongly in the values inherited from the past. To preserve those values in a society transformed by war would be their next challenge.